Now, this conflict has all the elements of the perfect mimetic conflict. We've all discussed that, we all know that. A fratricidal struggle, two mimetic peoples, Semitic peoples. There's the scapegoating, the rivalry, the tit-for-tat mimetic violence, the disappearance of difference. But I feel, and I hope we will continue, because I think an objective and balanced analysis which would encompass all these voices could demonstrate that there is a non-sacrificial possibility that could bring peace to both peoples, a homeland for the Jewish people, and justice for the Palestinians. I do hope that we continue. Anything less than a hearing of all these voices, I feel, would not honour the memory of Father Schwager. Thank you.
What I'm going to do is first ask my panelists to move. In the words of Monty Python, now for something completely different. Had you picked up a book in, let's say 1988, on intractable conflict, those books would have inevitably focused on three. It would have named South Africa, it would have named Northern Ireland, and it would have named the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. All of the things that have been said from a mimetic perspective, at least in critique, could be said and were said about the other two. So that it seems to me, and yet they've had different outcomes on that. So it seems to me that if you want to construct a kind of mimetic analysis on what Cover might do, or anybody else might do, we might ought to begin with a slightly different take, which is a mimetic reading of conflict resolution itself. Now, I mentioned my title last night to Wolfgang, and he said fine, but I could tell in his bones that he wanted it to be a brief, very brief. And rather than a mimetic reading, then maybe just a glance at conflict resolution. So I made my slide this way, but basically what I wanted to do was basically look at the cartoon. So let's begin. I want to start with the core assumption that I heard coming out of the Innsbruck group, which I take actually very seriously. So a deep, true, lasting peace among people, which is not based on sacrificing third persons and can exist without polarization into enemies, is very difficult or even exceeds human strength. If it nevertheless becomes a reality, this is a clear sign that God himself is acting in the people. I want to take that first part really seriously because I don't want, where I agree with the second theological statement, it's not where I want to focus. It's on what in the world would it mean, and I would change that to say, rather than is very difficult or even exceeds human strength, I'd say it's absolutely difficult and probably impossible. And indeed, if we did create something like, as I will show in a minute, a deep true life. And so from my real world engagement, I want to say what I think is possible is not that true lasting peace, but in fact a human peace which is very tentative, frail, partial, corrupt, makeshift, sullen, resented, and even resentful. That what we're able to do in any kind of real peace is to create that kind of tentative, day-to-day personal relationships that always is threatening to break up, to be undermined. We make that day by day within our relationships with each other. If we begin to do something much more than this, we will fall into sacrificial activity. So, I want to say, how is it that we approach in my center the notion of conflict resolution, and to begin to say that is how that meshes with a mimetic analysis of conflict resolution in general. So we look at the world and we say, gosh, there's conflicts all over the place that are much harder to resolve than an objective analysis of the interests involved would suggest. Okay? So that you could point out, any third party could point out 4, 5, 6, 700 things which the parties could move to where they would be better off than they are now. And so from a theoretical and even from a practical point of view, there should be no reason why they shouldn't move there. And yet in the real world, you find all over the place the parties aren't able to do so. So we ask the question, why? What stands in the way of them moving to a position in which both parties would be better off? What stands in the way? Now, in particular with regard to conflict resolution, basically the approach we take is, why does getting to yes not get to yes? What stands in the way? Why does this completely sensible approach fail to produce what its outcome, which is yes? And so I want to do a mimetic reading of what is the standard approach to conflict resolution, which is the getting to yes approach. So the first thing this thing suggests is that you distinguish interests from positions. The positions, oftentimes positions can't be combined, but interests are malleable. They can be put together in several ways. So don't ask what your position about something is. Try to identify what are the interests underlying that. You begin then to try to create value over claiming value, which allows you to then recognize the non-zero sum features of the conflict. You develop win-win outcomes, and then everybody goes off better and happy. Okay? You can already begin to see that there is some kind of mimetic critique you could give of this kind of standard thing. It would be nice if it works, but quite often it doesn't work. And so why? Now I want to say that a mimetic analysis would focus on what is the core exchange here. And I think this is where you can begin. I don't have much to go into the critique of that or talk much about the barriers, but let me just point out that the core exchange is an exchange that is built upon the different parties' assessments. So that I will trade what I value less for what you value more. Or let me put that back. I will trade what I value less for what you value more in exchange for what I value more but you value less. And so that's the whole thing that's going on in this kind of stuff. Now, what mimetic desire would say is that that's probably an illusion. That this kind of mimetic things will make it very hard to differentiate. When I want it less, it becomes less important to you. When I want it more, it becomes more important to you. And so that kind of exchange is problematic from a mimetic point of view. So if I wanted to begin to create what was a very imperfect, as I have said, non-sacrificial piece that would be very tentative in its orientation, I'd have to begin with what we don't spend, I think, enough time talking about in cover, which is good or positive mimesis. Now please note, I'm not trying to indicate some kind of ideal solution to any of this stuff. This positive mimesis that will develop, if it does at all between the parties, will be partial, tentative, frail, and in a word, imperfect. But nevertheless, how do we begin to interject into the parties and in the relationships and dynamics in those parties small increments of positive mimesis? And I think this would take place around what we call the four questions. And the claim that we make is that progress will be made either in negotiations and post-conflict peace-building situations, in a general political process, to the degree that progress is made around these four questions. Let me go through them briefly. The first question is the question of a shared future. Are the parties willing to envision a future for the other side that if the other side would find minimally bearable? Question two is the question of trustworthiness. How can the parties trust each other to honor the commitments and to take all of the intermediate steps toward that shared future? Question three, the question of loss acceptance. How can the parties accept the losses that a settlement imposes so they can make the concessions that it requires? And lastly, the question of just entitlements. How can the parties work together to alleviate the most egregious injustices? Let me say a further word about each one of these questions. The question of a shared future. Probably the best way to talk about a question of a shared future is to make a distinction. The vision of a shared future is not a shared vision of the future. A shared vision in future implies agreement, that we agree about what the future is. A vision of a shared future is actually something different. Are the parties willing to envision a future that the other side, if it heard it, would find minimally bearable? And that is simply this. When you hear me talk about my dreams and goals and aspirations, for me, myself, my family, my community,